Good morning. I'm Marilyn Hawes and I'm the CEO of Freedom from Abuse. And I'm thanking Leigh today for their support in doing the recordings in reference to the questions and answers section that we didn't manage to complete when we did our conference in October called Be the Child. So that's a great thing. There are lots of questions coming in, but we've all been asked to speak about what's what and what we're all up to. I really do thank Leigh. They have been enormously supportive and pro bono for us, and it means an awful lot because we struggle with funding. So it's very, very helpful and much appreciated. So what have Freedom from Abuse been up to? Well, actually, this very minute today, I have written to the Secretary of State for Education, Nadeem Sahari, in reference to this terrible tragic case of the little boy Arthur, and pushing for him to actually really do look at social services and their appalling situation with thresholds that don't meet requirements that schools struggle with, and the police that need to also join up more rather than at the moment it just is broken and it's not working. So we do a lot of campaigning as well when we think there's a burning issue, as well as writing courses. We've also got a new website which went live last week, so please have a look at that, www.freedom-abuse.org. And the training that's been going really well is something I feel very passionate about, is grooming. The person that might be a groomer in plain sight in your organization, especially, of course, schools. I do visit perpetrators in prison before COVID, obviously, people who are child abusers and sex offenders, to find out what they can tell me about their childhood and how they operate, their modus operandi, etc. And it's really quite revealing. What really irritates me is that so many schools get outstanding Ofsted or Independent Schools Inspectorate reports when the first question they should be asking is, would you be able to identify a perpetrator in plain sight? Now, if you can't and you don't know how to, then you can't best protect your students and therefore the parents and therefore the school with your reputation. Far too many times it's happened because I keep an eye on different reports and I see what's going on, and it is really quite a worry. So I would urge schools to step up to get this course that we started 18 years ago. Unfortunately, I am a mother whose three of my four children were sexually abused by the head teacher, and I was the deputy head, and I missed what grooming was. And this course is based on that lived experience with real stories, etc., and research, and what the offenders themselves tell us. So the other courses that have been going really well, one is called Beauty or the Beast. Basically, are you friendly with someone who's a bit of an arse or a diamond? And what does that look like? Schools, in my view, are too keen to look at healthy relationships, and young people need to be able to make an informed decision to recognize where it all kind of begins, you know, the coercive control, the gaslighting, what is consent, what is respect? And we cover all of those in a way that schools can't. So for example, if this pen here is the line of acceptability, then teachers will hover underneath that line. And the bit that we do, we break through the line and we take the children above it. And this is where the real education takes place, in that gap. And of course, teachers are restricted. I know that from when I was teaching. There's some things you cannot or dare not say. And I'm not entirely convinced that teachers, quite honestly, should be teaching some of these things in schools that are life skills, because they can't say the things, and neither should they, that we do. And we do another one, which is also very, very, the children love it, called Pitfalls for Teenagers. What are all those things you might encounter? You know, the binge drinking, how to not get drunk, the impact of alcohol on your system, fetal alcohol syndrome disorder when you're pregnant, what is stealthing, what is consent, what is respect, what is toxic masculinity, misogyny, what is the negative impact of overdosing on pornography. And again, these things are things we can do because we have the research, we have the contacts. We can provide this education in a way the schools can't. They don't have the real stories. They don't really know what we know. So, and there is no excuse at the moment because schools have the access of the COVID catch-up fund. So I would ask, if you're not going to actually access that fund at £1 a child, then there's something very wrong then, really, isn't there, with your mindset? Okay, so the other thing I want to thank Leigh for is their generous contribution, which was a wish of mine ever since my story began, of my story being groomed by that man who became my best friend. I met him in a church pew, was the headmaster of the school. I had no idea what he was up to. And this play is called Can't We Be Friends? And it was written by Brian Daniels, who Leigh commissioned to write it. And it really, when I listen to it, it still makes me quite chilled, because they really hit the spot. The guy that plays the abuser is absolutely excellent. The young man that plays my son, one of my 3 boys, is brilliant. And Brian, who plays my husband, Roger, all very good. And I always wanted to lay something down for people to understand the slimy, insidious way that grooming works and how you are duped, because they move in and they groom you when you're vulnerable. And because you're vulnerable, you appreciate the attention and you don't see what's coming at you. And I look back now, and some friends of mine were very suspicious, but they felt they couldn't tell me, which is such a tragedy. But it was written by Brian Daniels. If you want to watch it, and please do, I urge you to, go to the description box below the video and you can click on and hear it. So huge thanks yet again to Leigh. So what else would we like to do? We are now talking of a conference for 12th of May, 2022, a virtual conference in the morning, like we've done before. We want to extend our talk on peer-on-peer abuse and all the issues that presents. And my job is I find the speakers, and Leigh once again generously gift their staff to help us. And the last 2, we did one in March, Be Seen, Be Heard. We did one in October, Be the Child, all very well supported. And we think this one may be focusing on the next scandal this century, which of course is peer-on-peer abuse. Today, I have actually written to the Department of Education, the new Secretary of State for Education, Nadhim Zahawi, who obviously is running up and picking up the ball and running with it, to try and sort things out in the very, very sad and tragic death of the little 6-year-old boy, Arthur. This has been a problem for decades. I've been trying to campaign. We do campaign. I campaign when something really hits the spot. And this has got to stop. This amazing gap when schools know there is a child at risk and they're told by social services that it doesn't meet their thresholds. Then the police don't go any further with their investigations because social services say there's no safeguarding risk. This has got to stop. So I have actually invited him today to also speak at our conference next year, because I think we might like to be interested in how has he and what has he done in regards to the peer-on-peer abuse situation, because he'll then have been in post about 6 months, 7 months by then, and also what is now happening with this inquiry into little Arthur. So I think that would be great. I'm waiting to hear back. So I really hope we get him as a key speaker. We also have Andrew Lord, who is a lawyer at Leigh, who deals with the cases in court. We have got a wonderful man called Graham Golden, who was in the police for 30 years. He is passionate about dealing with the violence that is displayed with men and boys. And he is a very direct speaker. I've spoken to him myself. He's very direct and down to earth. A very interesting lady called Gail Dines, who is in America, in Boston, even though she comes from Manchester here in the UK. Oh my word, her presentations that she does on the impact of pornography on the developing brain are awesome, very exciting. And then I think we maybe need at least one or even a shared slot for 2 very respected heads that I know in education. It's going to be, I think, an exciting conference, some excellent speakers. So please watch this space. And thank you once again to Leigh for nothing is ever too much trouble. They are so patient, so accommodating, and so brilliant at what they do. Thank you ever so much. And you have a wonderful Christmas, and let's hit the ground running in 2022 and begin to make these positive changes. Like we need mandatory reporting. We cannot have people in senior management safeguarding leads, not referring things that need to go further into the authorities to be investigated. People are still escaping through the net, and it's wrong. So I thank you and see you in 2022.
Obesity is a complex issue that is relatively misunderstood because people are continually looking for biochemical or neurochemical pathways to explain it. And they exist, but they are intermediary mechanisms. They have nothing to do with causality. What we found is, in our major obesity program, where all of this began, where all of the ACE study findings, where the ACE study originated, really, we found that childhood sexual abuse was unbelievably common. I mean, believe me, it took me several months of checking and rechecking before I was convinced that this was real, because initially I felt, this can't be, something this outrageous people would know. But such is not the case. It is a highly suppressed issue. So childhood sexual abuse produces anxiety. That anxiety is often worsened by telling a parent about something that's happening and being told in return, oh, you're misunderstanding. Your uncle or your grandfather would never do anything like that. Don't say things like that, etc. So that obviously worsens the situation. All of us sometimes use food as a way of reducing anxiety and tension. In the United States, at least, the expression is very common. Sit down, have something to eat, you'll feel better, etc. Or, for alcohol, sit down, have a drink, relax. Sit down, have a cigarette, relax, that kind of thing. All of those processes have psychoactive benefits. And so eating is used by children quite commonly because it's easily accessible. And then many will consciously notice that after a certain amount of weight is gained, I'm not talking 5 or 10 pounds, I'm talking 30, 50, 100, etc., that it has a major desexualizing effect. In other words, there's a major but unspoken benefit of obesity. The risks are very real, long-term. The benefits in this sense are immediate. And that's part of what makes treating major obesity so difficult, because we are in effect attempting to take away a person's solution, not their problem. I have a video interview with an elderly woman, heavily molested as a child. Mother disbelieved her, told her she was misunderstanding things. She began heavily smoking. And as an early teenager was a 3-pack-a-day smoker. At 17, she married to escape her family. She weighed 130 pounds. At age 35, her husband finally was able to convince her to stop her 3-pack-a-day smoking for her health. She quit. She's suddenly faced with male sexual attention that she never had to deal with before, because as she explained to me, you smoke 3 packs a day, the cloud around you keeps people at a certain distance. Okay, so she is exceedingly anxious by not knowing how to respond to this male sexual attention, and eats, and that works. And she goes from 130 to 310 pounds. At 310 pounds, she goes into acute and chronic respiratory failure because the lung damage from her smoking, which she could tolerate at 130, she could not at 310. So I meet her decades later. We take her into our obesity program before we had fully figured out what we were actually doing. We take her from 310 to 150. She no longer needs the oxygen. Oh, wonderful. Haven't we done something terrific here? The male sexual attention returns, and she consciously makes the decision to get back over 300 pounds. She consciously makes that decision and accepts the fact that she's going to be on oxygen 24 hours a day the rest of her life. And in the course of discussing all of this, she makes this extraordinarily perceptive comment. She says to me, it's important to understand that weighing 300 pounds and smoking 3 packs a day are not the problem. They're the symptoms of the problem. And that's a profound insight and worth keeping in mind when one is dealing with obesity. One may be attempting to take away someone's solution to problems that we know nothing about. And that was the main thrust of our obesity program. It was not, we didn't waste any time trying to tell people how to eat right or give them dietary advice. We help them explore in small, stable groups. We help them explore why they began putting on weight at whatever point in their life they did, what was going on then, etc. In other words, looking at underlying causality and then helping people deal with that. So what we saw is that obesity has benefits. And one of the things that we used to do in these small, stable groups, we didn't treat people individually. We treated them in small groups of about 10 to 12. And that was a very important idea because the groups provided support to people emotionally. One of the questions that we posed to people was, what are the benefits of obesity? Not the risks. If you want the risks, you can get a government pamphlet and read that. What are the benefits? And the common answers were, people leave you alone, men won't bother you, people expect less of you, etc. It was a very interesting thing to hear these answers come repetitively for people, week in and week out at the weekly group meetings. I remember we had 2 men who were prison guards at the state penitentiary downtown. One lost 100, one lost 150 pounds. They were both very clear. Neither of them was comfortable walking into the prison cell blocks anymore at normal weight. They felt a lot better going and looking big as a refrigerator. And then you think, at least in this country, of the expression, throwing your weight around. So there's something to be kept, desexualization is the predominant benefit for women. For men, a major benefit, perhaps the predominant one, is the concept of throwing your weight around, the illusion that with size comes power. Someone brought up the issue of suppressed trauma being common, but not being recognized, and how red flags need to be identified. I disagree with the concept, not to say that it doesn't ever work, but I disagree with it because the red flags are not precise, are not sufficiently precise to provide the goals that you want. The thing that we did was we collected the requisite information initially by inert mechanism, not face-to-face. Face-to-face is very time-consuming, and because all of us have been very effectively taught as children that nice people don't talk about certain things, when we try to bring up questions like incest, rape, etc., we often are uncomfortable posing those questions. That's recognized by patients, and they decide not to share with somebody who's not even comfortable asking about the subject. So what we did, we blended these questions, the 10 categories of ACE questions, into a very lengthy general medical questionnaire that everyone had to fill out at step 1 of comprehensive medical evaluation. In my department at Kaiser Permanente, we had a division called Health Appraisal, where we provided uncommonly comprehensive and detailed medical evaluation to over 50,000 adults a year in one setting. It was the largest single site operation of its type in the Western world. Step one of that 2-visit process was filling out a 10-page medical questionnaire at home that dealt with lifetime biomedical issues. And I decided to integrate the ACE questions into that. My colleagues assured me I was crazy, patients would be furious, no one will tell you the truth anyway, none of which was true. Instead, I have stacks of letters of thanks from patients. And indeed, I was often stopped in the hallway by people going home at the end of the process, thanking me for asking those questions on the questionnaire. And then often telling me how grateful they were to the examiner, who, hearing the dark secrets of their life, was still nice to me afterwards, and they want to see me again even, etc. Getting this information routinely, not on selected basis, using so-called red flags, getting this routinely on everyone has a huge payoff. And a mathematician at the University of California, who had a startup data mining company, hearing about what I was doing on the huge scale that I was doing, carried out a 135,000 patient study. This was now in a general population, not in the obesity program. That 135,000 people was a 2.5-year throughput for the Health Appraisal Division, to see whether integrating the ACE questions had any discernible impact. Incredibly, he found that integrating the ACE questions triggered a 35% reduction in doctor office visits in their next year compared to their prior year, and an 11% reduction in emergency room visits in their subsequent year compared to their antecedent year. The dollar value of this is enormous. It has attracted the attention of 23 state legislatures out of the 50 states in the United States, who have passed legislation designed to support the routine collection of ACE information in medical practice. So this is really worth knowing the benefits of this. And hearing this, people would say to you, how do you do that? You send everyone to therapy, right? No, we did not send everyone to therapy. We send very few people to therapy. I'm a big believer in therapy, but it's an inefficient, although effective process, hence costly. I don't meet many patients who tell me, oh, don't worry, doctor, I put aside $50,000 for psychotherapy. So how did we get this effect? Well, we asked people, and the way we asked was interesting. We would take the questionnaire that they had filled out at home, pass it through a digital scanner that picked up all of the yes answers, organized those by body systems, gave us a nice 2-3-page laser printout. It would take 2 or 3 minutes to read before meeting the patient. And then we would say to a patient, I see on the questionnaire that. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? And we listened, period. We did one other thing, but again, it took the patients to explain this to us. We implicitly accepted them, as in patients telling me how grateful they were to the examiner, who, hearing the dark secrets of their life, was still nice to me and wants to see me again. So that was a very important concept, that the information be initially collected by an inert mechanism. And then what worked for us so well, I see on the questionnaire that, you were raped, you were molested as a little kid, that your mother abandoned the family when you were 4 years old, that your father committed suicide, etc. Can you tell me how that's affected you later in your life? And we listened, period. No humbug about, oh, I'm so sorry, that must have been dreadful. No, we listened, period. And we implicitly accepted. So it was a very interesting experience. And ultimately I saw that we had accidentally created a lay analog of confession in the Catholic Church. and I'm not saying this is a religious person because I'm not, but confession has been in use for 1,800 years, suggesting, maybe it meets some basic human need. And in that process, which is brief, minutes long, one is enabled to tell somebody important, in that case, a priest, in ours, a doctor or a nurse practitioner, some dark secret of their life, and realize within a minute or two that they're still part of the group, that they're still accepted, etc. So these are important issues to keep in mind when treating serious obesity, but equally alcoholism. Why is someone an alcoholic? Good starting question, as we found with obesity. How old were you when you first began putting on weight? How old were you when you first began heavy drinking? Why do you think it was then? How old were you when you started buying street drugs? Why do you think it was then? How old were you when you began smoking heavily? Why do you think it was then? Etc. And that has been just enormously productive to us and enabled us to see that the exposure of children to major household dysfunction is vastly more common than we would anticipate, including household sexual abuse. In the obesity program, in an 1,100 patient sample, 55% of the adult men and women acknowledged a history of childhood sexual abuse. In the ACE study, which was 17,337 people from a general population, and this was clearly a middle-class population. 74% had been to college, etc. 28% of the women and 16% of the men acknowledged a history of childhood sexual abuse. So these things are very common, and they really need to be screened in a general population uniformly, not looking for red flags to, be the marker for whether you pose these questions or not. Now, in that regard, some other ideas are worth keeping in mind. And we've done this in a couple of instances. We've convinced the editor of a local newspaper to publish the one-page version of the ACE study questionnaire, just 10 straightforward questions, asking readers to respond anonymously. Then several days later, and mailing them back without a return address on the envelope or anything. Then several days later, pooling that data, publishing the pooled data. And the effect on communities was extraordinary. Have you seen what's in the paper? My God, you won't believe what's there, etc. The publishers were, needless to say, very pleased because their advertising revenues are based on readership. But it was really an extraordinary insight. And if you want to galvanize interest in a community virtually overnight, this is a good way of doing it. You could do it also in a school, in an auditorium. Ask the kids to fill out the questionnaire anonymously, put it in a box, pool the data, bring them back later, project the pooled data on a screen. What do you think this means? And the interesting thing there is that people are free to speak because, hey, I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about everybody else in the room here. So people are far more free to express their thoughts than one might expect in that kind of situation. An interesting experiment with something like the National Health Service would be to take the questionnaire that we developed and give it to, say, a sample of 1,000 people, randomly selected, and then compare what happens to them the next year in terms of medical utilization, in terms of their satisfaction with their care, their lives, etc., and comparing them with a control group of 1,000 who did not have that kind of questionnaire supplied to them. It might provide an interesting insight for people paying the bill of the National Health Service as it has with, as I say, 23 out of 50 state legislatures in the United States.
As a school practitioner, I've regularly found that parents are often complicit when abuse occurs. So we have to spend really quite a lot of time checking into the depth of a problem before involving parents into the discussion and emerging opinions on severity of harm and sequencing support and aid. Of course, parents hold a key role in managing the safety of their children. And post-triage, we'd hope to fully ensure all are fully engaged in the next steps and solutions thereafter. Innocent parents are likely to become pretty emotional about the news of their child's abuse. So great care is needed when including parents into the process of triage. Hearing the voice of the child is important. Understanding the central position of the child and what they have to say is one of the key bits of experience I draw into the discussion. The presence of a parent can often muffle or otherwise influence the engagement of the child. In a school setting, the conduct of the designated safeguarding lead, DSLs as we know them, is covered by KICSI 2021. And if it becomes clear that the parents are linked to the problem, then the DSL must call for multi-agency support first, as directed by KICSI and Working Together 2018.
In my own opinion and how my life spanned out when I wanted to disclose, I did go to a professional, which is my GP, who actually told me that I had 2 successful sons, that I was still married to go away and get on with it. But I was still strong enough because I had suffered for a couple of years and didn't know why. So I went to my GP to find out why. I insisted that he gave me a counsellor's name. And because I have been sexually abused and the trust thing, I wasn't sure about counsellors because I'd never been to one. He did give me a name and a telephone number, but he also gave me the information that if I ever used it, I would be worse off than I was then. So that was actually quite devastating because that put fear in me. And that number I did place on my fridge, and I never used it. And it did take me 5 more years, really, to actually approach the subject again. And this was without professionals. There was a group that had started up in our local area, and it's called Stop Start group. So I decided to go along, and for probably a good year, because the meetings were once a month, for a good year, I just listened to them. And I was hearing other stories from other survivors. And one thing I got out of it is never to go to the police, because they had been more damaged by the police and without any results. So I was now 63 at this particular point. I was 51 when I first went to my doctor. So you can see what an impact that GP made on me. I did keep going back to I didn't go back to that GP at all. I dropped him totally. But I have to say that most of the other GPs weren't that helpful, because I thought I was having heart attacks. Now, looking back on it, they were anxiety. So I'd go along for ECGs. I didn't sleep very well, and they wanted to put me on sleeping tablets, which they did. But that didn't work. I did actually manage to get to the sleep clinic, but that was with a lot of persuasion of yet another doctor. They never understood me. It seemed like a tick box exercise. They were very uncomfortable with what I was telling them, and yeah, nobody actually steered me with all these problems I was having. That it was my childhood sex abuse that was causing all the problems, and nobody was addressing it. So in fact, I cost the National Health a lot of money, and because I didn't know, and nobody told me, and nobody knew. Or so I had various, now I see, symptoms that quite a few survivors have. That I was going to my doctor, and they weren't being addressed, or they were trying to address them. I mean, they did actually try to give me a depression. So you done this test to see if you were depressed. And to be fair, had I not slept that night, I probably would have been, the tick box exercise would have told them that I was depressed. So and then they automatically put you on antidepressants. And I've seen someone, I have a relative that had been sexually abused as a child and was put on antidepressants very early in her life. She's now in her 60s and she's still on them. I didn't want to go along that route. So if professionals do you more damage, they're not the people to go to. If they haven't got the information all the time, or they haven't got the thought that it could be childhood sex abuse. I mean, it wasn't even recorded. So how could the other doctors know that I'd been in for this? The original doctor didn't even record I'd gone in for it. So I joined the group and I listened for probably about a year, and I could see that they were all going for counselling, and it was them that actually encouraged me to try for counselling. And plus the counselling agency, charity that was involved in the Stop Start group were the people who were doing the counselling, because the other women didn't have adverse problems, so they actually gave me the courage to go on for counselling. With this particular charity, people who were in training would give up a year for you and work for the charity for nothing. So she gave up a year for me. I had to learn how to speak, really, because I didn't know how to speak about myself. I didn't know about myself. And she was really helpful. I cried a lot because I hadn't cried. I cried a lot, but she started to teach me about my inner child and how I'd been affected by what had happened to me. And she encouraged me to go to different groups, like self-esteem groups and things like that. She never seemed to minimize anything that I wanted to do. And I was reading quite a lot of self-help books. One in particular, when I was going with her, is The New Shoes by Rachel Mitchell, who was a survivor herself. And I could actually ask her questions because of what I read and how it had hit me, and how I'd connected with some of the things that was being said in the book. And the counselling went on for a year, and I have to say that she did really help me. But we were only allowed a year, and I didn't have any money to actually go and have counselling anywhere else, and there was still the trust problem. I then went on to London to Rachel Mitchell. She had an event once a year in London, and all the speakers had been sexually abused. All the people in there had been sexually abused, or there were counsellors in there trying to help their clients. And for the first time, I felt I'd met my family. Because after the years going to the counsellor, there was a lapse of a few months, and I thought, you know, I think I've done it, but I didn't actually talk about the sex abuse. There wasn't the time to. It was all about the effects it had left me with. So that's why I started to seek other help. And I went to Rachel Mitchell's thing, and it was really inspiring for me. I knew that if I ever went to anyone else, they had to understand about childhood sex abuse. So I went back to my doctors again, and I had to self-refer myself to Sue Lambert, which is the only place in Norfolk that actually deals with childhood sex abuse, but it is 50 miles away. So it's over an hour's journey there and an hour's journey back. And it was really quite hard. I did join the group there, but that really didn't make that much. I could never make out really what that group was about. I couldn't understand it. The only good thing about it is I'd met two ladies that I really got on well with, and we were phone buddies, and they really helped me because we could share our stories if we didn't meet, if we wanted to, and we could talk to one another how we got over different things or shared different things with that person, knowing they weren't going to judge us, they weren't going to do a tick box exercise, and we were understanding of one another. So although I didn't get the group, I got two buddies, and I'm still in touch with these buddies to this day. But then I met Marilyn in 2017, and I see her on the TV. Like I've said, I see her on the TV, and she was just so open about everything, and she spoke about it as though it wasn't a shameful thing to be talking about, but that the person she was trying to help needed to be helped rather than ridiculed or minimized or silenced. And once I'd contacted her, she was just brilliant with me because she wanted me to get her down to Norfolk to go to the Sue Lambert group. But I wasn't in the place to do that. And I did ask Sue Lamberts, would they do it? But they didn't. And I asked the other charity that I was involved in that I had a year, would they do it? And they didn't. This took several months. And then what I thought to myself is the only person that's ever going to get her down is me. So I started on my journey of having Marilyn down and meeting Marilyn for the first time. And whenever I went back to her, if I was struggling, because I had to find a place for nothing, because she was going to come and do it for nothing, and I hadn't got no money. So, and whatever I went back with, she always gave me suggestions and then left me to it. And I could go back to her at any point. So I always felt comfortable with Marilyn because she seemed to know what I needed. And we had a really successful day. It did take quite a while to get the people together, but I persisted and I did do it. But at no point was there any pressure for me to think anything, do anything, or be anything with Marilyn. It was, you do it in your own time, your own pace. I'll give you suggestions. And to this day, she still helps me if I get a bit stuck. I'll say, give me a start, Marilyn, and she does. During this time also, I started to do the Truth Project. That really helped because as people were listening to you and they were very trauma informed. And and I just think that was a brilliant thing for me to do. Although I had to go on my own from Norfolk to London to attend it. But I was left with the impression, and it never fazed me to ask to join the forum, which I returned again 3 more times. And I'm still in contact with the Child Inquiry. So that was a really good thing. I did some research with the King's College in London, and that was interesting because there was other women there, and I learned about myself from some of the other people who were helping with this research. They had all been sexually abused, but they were all different ages. And that was really good. That really helped me. So my progression has been that I've taken on challenges. And I think it was the meeting of Marilyn that made me see it was possible. And I was more in control of what I wanted to do. And I've done lots of different things, made many, I tried to put some things together for Marilyn to come down, and met some really good people. And all that helps me because I'm learning about what happens to you when you were sexually abused as a child. And it's helped me to understand some of my triggers. And therefore, I've been able to take control of my triggers. I can control them rather than they controlled me, and it would affect me for days. I think now my triggers control me no more than anybody else who has certain triggers. I feel them, but I know how to manage them. And that's because I'm less fearless and I can go forward. I do think we need somewhere to register that we were sexually abused as a child, because I just think that we do. And GPs, to me, seem the right place to go. But if they're not trained, they can re-traumatize a survivor. Maybe having a lived experience person attached to doctor's surgeries would actually be helpful, because that can lower your anxiety and you get a better interview with your doctor if you've got somebody who understands you before you even go in. I think that's all I have to say about professionals. I'm not sure about professionals. All the other professionals I have had haven't necessarily helped me. It's been the lived experience people that have. I did go to a wellbeing group that was organised by NHS, and I can't remember the psychologist giving the presentation, but I can remember the guy who was the lived experience person who would give us tips. I still have him on my shoulder. But I'm blessed that I've managed to do all this, and I haven't had to go on medication, or I've been strong enough not to go on medication. But I do know that there are people out there who are steered that way. Again, I think I've already explained it in lots of ways, that Marilyn Hawes and the way she treated me inspired me, or give me the courage to try things out. And some of them failed, but it was okay. And my phone buddies, all the things that I've actually done, trying to get help for other people, because I went round Norfolk for 2 years trying to get help, asking various people to get help, and they would steer me to someone, and you'd go there with hope, and you either weren't in the right place, you weren't the right gender, you weren't the right age group. There was always something that didn't work for you. So although we're quite good at writing stuff down on paper, when you actually go for the treatment, it's not there. That actually made me stronger, really, by continually to go round. And if I do come across people, and I do quite often, who have been sexually abused, I go back to the charity or whatever it is and try and drill down to what they are actually offering, because sometimes it's on paper and it doesn't actually exist, or it's going to do more damage to that person because I've directed them there, telling them, thinking that it's available, and it's not. So doing all the things that I do a lot of, I go on Zoom a lot, and I do a lot of webinars on the way that your brain works, about trauma. I've educated myself about what happened to me, and I just think that is so important. Being with other people who've experienced this, and if we happen to talk, all of a sudden I understand myself a little bit, because I'm growing constantly. But I think I've started off as a teenager at 63, which is when you start to learn. And I think it feels to me like I had stopped growing, and was an adult without any knowledge of me. And what happened to me, I really do think that survivors, if they want it, they need to have the information and knowledge of why they are like they are, saying they have a choice of changing it if they wish to, but you don't know what you don't know. And I feel survivors, they do need to actually have that opportunity to know, to gain knowledge on what has happened to them. I do know also by meeting people that sometimes they've gone on a psychology degree, and I've said to them, oh, you know all about ACEs then? And it wasn't covered. So I think this is another thing, really, that we believe that these people know the best for us, and they don't necessarily, and it's not their fault, it's because it hasn't been included in whatever degree or education they've gone to. And we need to speak about it. We need to make it that it's okay to speak about childhood sex abuse, because it happens. And a lot of it is in the family, and it is the most detrimental, because your family don't want to talk to you about it, because they'll take sides. And for me, I was a mum who did everything because I had nothing done for me. And then you have to change to actually be able to find yourself. And I did change, but I'm still strong enough to know that the pushback I get, I have to endure as another trauma as such, until my family can see that this is who I should have been in the first place. So I think education for families is so important too. I learned that at the forum for the child inquiry, and I discovered through my recovery that if men have suffered childhood sex abuse and they have the courage to tell their wives are always supportive, and they say their recovery is far quicker because they have people where they are around them, their family, supporting them. But I haven't met anybody who's a female survivor and their partner has stuck by them. I don't know why. Maybe it's the sort of person we marry. I don't know, but that's what I've observed. But you do need family to understand, because to heal, even if you're going to counselling or something like that, you've got to be really strong to keep going when you haven't got the backup of your family. And that can so often happen, unfortunately. Thank you.
One of the questions I've been asked is, what is the correlation between trauma and dissociation? So, for example, post-traumatic stress disorder has two subtypes of dissociation which is associated with it. One of them is called derealization and one of them is called depersonalization. And they are the two dominant dissociative types in relation to post-traumatic stress disorder. So if you're working with PTSD or you have PTSD, it would be a really good idea for you to look up what is derealization and what is depersonalization. And they are very, very prevalent with anyone that has trauma. There are a number of other types of dissociation as well. And for example, structural dissociation, which is you're going to be coming across that all the time if you have complex trauma, complex PTSD, and you're working with it or you're experiencing it. Another one that people are discussing a lot of the time is DID, which stands for Dissociative Identity Disorder, formerly known as Multiple Personality Disorder. The majority of people that have experienced dissociative identity disorder, it's a response to severe sexual abuse. And that's not to say it's solely related to sexual abuse, but I've never come across anybody without a severe sexual abuse history. However, there are a number of misconceptions about this. People relate it to being very, very common, like that thousands or millions of people with it. However, to actually discern whether that's true or not, one needs to be screened for it properly. So when somebody goes to a therapist or they go to a doctor and they might present a specific way one day and a specific way another day, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have dissociative identity disorder. They might have structural dissociation, they might have a different type of subtype of dissociation. However, to actually find out if somebody has dissociative identity disorder, one does actually need to screen for it properly. So screening for it is where you meet a criteria, and a criteria means that you actually have the specific symptom clusters that meet the criteria to create a diagnosis. So without that, you cannot actually say that you have DID or that you think your friend has it or anybody has it for that matter, because one can present in a certain way with a certain attitude one day, and they can present a different way another day. And that's not to say that that isn't trauma related. It's just that to confirm whether it is DID, structural dissociation, derealization, depersonalization, and some other types of comorbid personality disorders or mental health diagnosis, to really understand if that's what's going on, one does need to be screened for it. However, I've noticed there seems to be a trend with different kind of comorbid labels around trauma and complex trauma, and it comes in different phases. So sometimes borderline personality disorder, emotion dysregulation disorder, all of those come in and out of phases of buzzwords, and that's what I have and that's what I have. However, unless people are screened by a psychiatrist, psychologist, trauma specialist, and they've actually met the clinical criteria, that diagnosis they've given themselves, or maybe a therapist has said, oh, it sounds like you've got this, it's irrelevant, because to actually be diagnosed with something, you need to meet a criteria. So I just wanted to bring in how you need to be matched to a diagnosis properly, because a therapist can't diagnose you. A person can't diagnose himself, a friend can't diagnose themselves. You can look on the internet and you can look at some of the symptoms, but actually you need to meet a specific criteria. And the reason for that is it's mainly about safety. Because if we start to identify ourselves as having a diagnosis and we meet a criteria that we don't know whether we meet or not, it means that we're going to start viewing ourselves in a certain perspective. And that perspective might not actually be beneficial or helpful. It might help you in some ways to help you realize, oh yeah, I recognize that symptom and I do that and I do that. So that's okay. But I'd be very, very careful about giving oneself a diagnosis without a proper screening. And also self-responsibility as well. If somebody really does believe that they meet a criteria, then they do need to seek mental health advisory service, and they do need to register with their doctor, and they do need to pursue a proper assessment. So dissociation and trauma, they're completely related, and dissociation as well happens on a neurological level. It's not just a coping strategy that some people say it is, because it isn't. It's happening in the brain. So there is a lot of information about the neurology of dissociation out there. I've even written an article, and if anybody would like to access it, feel free to contact me. However, it's really, really important, and I can't stress enough the importance of having a proper diagnosis used with screening tools and psychometric inventories. So yeah, so that's my question in response to the correlation of trauma and dissociation. People are very curious to know, will I ever go back to how I was before the trauma? No, because you're different now. And you can look at that as a negative thing, or you can look at it as a positive thing. So for example, if you have, say you have complex trauma, and that means you've grown up in a complex environment, you've had every adverse childhood experience going, you go through a therapeutic program, you receive proper processing, and you are no longer triggered or activated by the trauma anymore. However, if you think about it, if all you've ever known is trauma, how can you go back to a way of being before the trauma if that's all you've known? So post-traumatic growth is where you reshape yourself, and all the aspects of yourself that you want to develop, you develop. So if somebody has had a really happy lifestyle and then they have a car accident or one incident and they get PTSD, can they go back to who they were before the incident? They can go back to a lot of who they were, but you can't take away the fact that incident did happen. And that might not have any emotional, psychological or physical charge to it anymore. But essentially, you're a different person, whether you've had trauma or not. Every day you wake up new. Every day you wake up with a new choice. Every day you wake up different. So do you go back to who you were? You might recover a lot of your aspects of who you were. But like I said, every day we evolve with trauma or without trauma. So you'll be an evolved state of your own self, is my response to that question. So psychological debriefing is what happens in a lot of agencies. So in the agencies, it might be a first responders unit. They can have psychological debriefing after an incident, which could have potentially given them PTSD. So there's some research that says it's really helpful, and lots of people say it's really helpful in the moment. However, there's other research that says actually the people that received psychological debriefing after this incident, their symptom clusters of PTSD evolved and didn't reduce. Whereas the people that didn't receive psychological debriefing, their PTSD symptom clusters didn't evolve as much. So it depends on what research that you read and what your context of work is and what your own perspective is. And also what it doesn't highlight in some of the research is, did this person have complex trauma from their upbringing before they got PTSD from working? Because if you have a complex trauma history, your brain has a predisposition for getting PTSD after a single incident trauma later on in life. So you've got to look at all the different aspects surrounding a situation rather than saying psychological debriefing is good and helpful or it's not. Everything is dependable on all the components that are in it. So that's my answer to that one. Okay, Thank you. Thank you so much for the question. It's actually a very, very interesting question. So with regards to the age of obviously of children, non-verbal communication and indicators, the question really was with regards to the hierarchical positions within the family and whether this necessarily would cross over into the classroom. I think that's it's a very interesting question asked, and we've done quite a bit of research around actually where a child will sit within the family, and we're currently looking around both sibling rivalry, and especially when we're looking at situations where one child may excel, for example, at a sport or music or academically, where does that leave the other child, and actually in terms of emotions around such activities? So I do think it's quite a good point. I would say it's possibly more of a statement than a question. But with regards to it essentially coming back into the classroom, I think where you sit within your family home and your upbringing, it will shape the way in which we understand safeguarding, not just in a classroom, but in many other aspects as well. We do a lot around attitudes, values, and beliefs, and actually safeguarding is really shaped from within the home. How you see safeguarding will be very, very different to how I will see safeguarding and how our neighbours will see safeguarding, based on the fact that we have had different upbringings. So I think it is really important that when we're looking at safeguarding, we are not just looking at the children presented in front of us. We really do also need to take into consideration the households where they're sitting again within their family circumstances, and again looking at those attitudes, values, and beliefs. So I hope that has answered that question, but again, very, very interesting point made, so thank you.
Yeah, so the first question is asking about the impact of like recent media coverage about different examples of violence by men and what impact that has. And I think we need to shine a light on the extent of the problem, first and foremost. So in a way, that media coverage is needed, because especially when we think about, for example, violence against women and girls, I think for large parts of history, we as a society have not done enough to recognize how big a problem this is and how much harm it causes in society, and how much it kind of holds back the lives of women and girls, really, and constrains their freedom in society to be able to participate and contribute equally in society. So I think that is really important. But I mean, I see what perhaps the question's getting at as well, in the sense of like, we don't necessarily want to kind of like demonize men, perhaps as if like, create the idea somehow that like men are inherently violent or something like that, which, perhaps you see all this horrific media coverage on a day-to-day basis of all of this violence and abuse in society, and how prevalent that is, unfortunately, perhaps can create this idea that, like men are somehow inherently violent or something like that. And I think that isn't the case at all. That's why I do this work. That's why I focus on prevention, is because I think actually we could be preventing so much of this violence and abuse in society if we were doing a lot more to stop it from happening in the first place from a young age, in places like schools. So I suppose what I'd like to see, perhaps, we need to shine more of a light on the problem in terms of these different forms of violence and abuse and how prevalent they are in society. But we also need to shine more of a light on the different ways of being a man, actually. There are lots of men and boys do not use violence and abuse, and they're actually, they are speaking out about that. They are challenging that. They are trying to put into practice different ways of being a man, and they are kind of actually opening up ideas about masculinity. And I think that is key to tackling this problem. So yeah, I'd also like to see in the media much kind of more, much wider, more diverse representations of men and boys, really, and and ways of being a man or a boy which doesn't involve violence or physical strength or power or kind of authority or dominance, but actually being open and peaceful and inclusive and having healthy relationships and friendships with others and supporting each other. Why do we not see those things more as well? So no, I think that's a great question. Thank you. So the second question is about, I suppose, the stigma which is attached to men who do perpetrate forms of violence and abuse. And that's a really interesting question, because on the one hand, I think that we should stigmatize, using violence against women. Like, that should be seen as being morally reprehensible. And I suppose actually one of the issues is currently in society, we don't necessarily do that all the time, actually. I think you can think of many examples of men using violence or harassment, abuse towards women, and actually it's seen as perhaps to some extent being okay, or we come up with excuses for that, or it's kind of normalized in men's peer groups and nobody does actually challenge it. So on the one hand, I think we do need to actually clearly express that this kind of behavior is completely unacceptable, whether that is kind of in society at large, in its places like the media or in politics or different parts of our society, but also in our peer groups. We as men in particular, need to make it clear to each other that we don't think that kind of behavior is okay. We don't support it, or there are no excuses for it. It's a choice, and it's always a choice, and that is a choice which we don't find to be ever okay. But at the same time, I can see what the question's getting at, again, in the sense of I suppose if we stigmatize it so much, then is there a risk that men who are actually concerned about their behavior, we want men who are, if they are being abusive, for example, in a relationship, or if they're worried that their behavior, that they're not, that they're behaving in ways which actually they are concerned about, or which they don't actually like, or they're not proud of, that they would actually come forward and get help to change their behavior. So we want men to do that, and so maybe there's something there around I not completely permanently demonizing anyone who uses any form of violence or abuse, and be prepared for the possibility that people can change, and that's obviously what we want. We want to work with anyone who has used violence or abuse in their lives to change their behavior so that they don't do that again. And I think that change is entirely possible if we put in the necessary resources and time and effort to actually do that kind of work with people, to really rehabilitate them, I suppose. And I think there's another thing there as well around, perhaps not, I think it's often still when we talk about perpetrators of things like domestic abuse or sexual violence, I think we treat them as very separate from everyone else. Just the idea of being the terminology we use, like perpetrators, it's as if they're this completely separate group from everyone else. Perhaps, we talk about them almost sometimes as being these kind of monsters, which are completely unlike anyone else in society. But of course, we know that isn't the case. Perpetrators of different forms of violence and abuse are just the same as the rest of us. They're ordinary people. They are typically men, so they're ordinary men that we may well know. They're statistically, there's a good chance that we probably do know men who have enacted some form of violence or abuse in their lives, and I suppose if we recognize that more, then perhaps that would actually help us to actually kind of move forward in tackling this problem, in terms of actually getting people to change their behavior, getting people to get the kind of support they need to address their behavior, and also in terms of prevention as well, that actually, we can understand that if people who do perpetrate things like domestic abuse, they're not individual monsters. They're actually learning these kinds of ideas about gender norms in relationships, gender inequalities in everyday life, from society as a whole. These are very mainstream ideas, unfortunately, which we see all around us in the media. You think about something like pornography. There's a lot of research showing that very mainstream pornography is giving out very unhealthy, unequal ideas about sex, for example. So So, you know, men who are perpetrating these kinds of abusive behaviors aren't necessarily behaving in ways which are so deviant from what they're learning from the kind of mainstream culture of our society. And that isn't in any way to excuse their behavior, because obviously lots of men, as I said, are not using violence. But I suppose it's to recognize that actually, yeah, if we are serious about preventing this, then we need to be, rather than thinking that the problem is just with a very small number of very deviant individuals who are somehow pathological in some way, the problem is actually much deeper than that, much broader than that. It's with society as a whole, and it's with how boys are learning to be men and what they learn, what they think, what they learn about what's okay, how, you know, what is acceptable behavior in a relationship, for example. What are the norms and expectations around being a man in a relationship or within kind of sexual interactions, for example. So yeah, I think that does raise the question then of how can we actually look much more broadly and think about how these issues affect all of us. You know, how all of us encounter these everyday acts of sexism and misogyny, for example, and how can we challenge that, because we never know who might be hearing those comments. You know, we might laugh it off because we think, well, that's silly, but you know, I'm not going to think any more of it. But you know, the person making that comment, you know, who knows how what they might be doing in their own kind of personal lives, and what behavior therefore we might be, without intending to, actually legitimize perhaps in their own lives. Yeah, so I think it's a great question as well. Thank you for asking it.
Well, in answer to the question about the reliability of my suggestion as to whether child sex abuse has gone down during the COVID pandemic, in particular at home, I would say that I think my figures do have to be treated with a bit of caution, because they are based upon reported cases only, and in particular cases reported to the NSPCC. And reported cases tend to be a poor reflection about what's happening in society more generally. But that said, the NSPCC figures do indicate that while there was a dramatic rise in reports of some forms of child maltreatment, such as child physical abuse, that didn't apply to child sexual abuse. So there is a suggestion there that cases of incidents of child sexual abuse may have gone down. But the presentation, the figures I presented were based upon a paper I wrote about 6, 9, 12 months ago. So I do have to update those figures, and I'll be trying to get some more reliable figures as to what may have happened with incidents of child sexual abuse during the pandemic. Also, viewers may recall that I did present figures about child sexual abuse that took place in schools. And obviously with the lockdown, very few children and young people were going to school. Now, I quoted in my presentation, if I just remind myself, the prevalence of sexual touching of children and young people at school is 22%. The prevalence of particularly young people having sexual images of themselves distributed without their consent is 30%, and 36% of young people and children report being victims of sexual harassment. So basically, there is a considerable problem of, problematic sexual behaviour within schools, and with children and young people not going to schools, then they will have been protected from those forms of harm. Now, that's not to say, obviously, that we should simply shut schools in order to protect children, but one of the central messages of my presentation was really that the pandemic and its relationship with child protection and child abuse is much more complicated than some people may have come to believe. We've also been asked to address the issue of, how can services be better able to address violence by men, particularly when there's so much stigma around the subject, and men might be reluctant to, receive services. Now, I don't have a sort of chapter and verse response to that question, but I would say that I think it's important that messages about the prevention of violence, whether it's by men, women, young people, but messages about the prevention of violence and interventions around the perpetration of violence should permeate the whole of society. So rather than it being just down to services or particular groups, you know, we do need to address the problem of violence on a societal level, and it really needs to be brought home to people how big a problem this is and how much we need to address it. And it's only one small example, but I did have an idea some years ago. I didn't ever get a chance to act upon it, but I thought every single building, I mean, the commercial, institutional, organizational building in the country ought to have a notice, a leaflet, a pamphlet about, or a poster about, for example, domestic abuse, and particularly domestic abuse against women. Addressing violence needs to be at the forefront of all of our minds, and that's why if we are going to improve services, then I think we need to permeate society with messages and interventions around violence, whatever form it takes.